Tonight, in 2 hours from now, in the heart of Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, the bells will start tolling of the Mikhailsky monastery, just like they tolled 2 years ago, which was a very symbolic event because 2 years ago it was the first time since 1240 that these bells were tolling. The last time they tolled was during the invasion of the Tatar-Mongol hordes, and they warned the population of Kiev against the impending disaster. This time they were tolling to warn the Ukrainian population, the citizens of Kiev, of the impending attack of the riot police Berkut on the demonstrators at Maidan Square. I was there on the 10th, 2 years ago. The next day, the Berkut attacked the city hall, and they used water cannons because it was freezing, and they thought that by using water cannons it would get too cold for the demonstrators and they would leave. And instead of leaving, the demonstrators stayed, and the water turned into ice on the stairs of the municipal building. And so when Berkut tried to attack the city hall, they were sliding down the stairs and they had to withdraw. I was there again in January during the fighting at Rushevsky when the first people died. And I was there again in February when the fighting erupted on Institutska and dozens of demonstrators were killed by snipers and by Berkut. For me, Maidan was absolutely fantastic event, and not only because I was participating in a national uprising, but also because it was the biggest present I could get for 38 years of trying to fight for human rights in the Soviet Union and in the successor states. It was the young generation which was taking the future into their own hands. It was the young generation that said enough is enough. And it was not so much a choice between the European Union and Russia. It was much more a choice for dignity and against a corrupt regime that was turning the country into their own personal property. So why was Maidan so important for me? And why did I get involved in issues of human rights in the Soviet Union? I think for me, looking backwards, probably the main reason is that my family was very much affected by the Second World War. 2 uncles of mine were in the resistance. One of them returned, heavily damaged. The other did not survive. He went through 7 Nazi concentration camps, eventually managed to escape. Was found, liberated by the Americans, and died 2 weeks later at the age of 28 because of dysentery, malaria, and exhaustion. And so for us in the family, the war was always there. It was always an issue to discuss at the kitchen table. And so when I became involved in human rights issues in the Soviet Union, I understood that I needed to have a pseudonym in order to be able to work for human rights and at the same time still be able to get a visa to the Soviet Union, so I had to choose a pseudonym. And for me it was very logical that a pseudonym would be the pseudonym that my uncle used during the resistance. So I became the kind of second Robert van Voren. During the first years, for me, issues were very much black and white. So we were the good guys, the dissidents, political prisoners, we supporters in the West, and they were the bad guys, the KGB officers, the leadership of the Soviet Union, the people that participated in this regime. And that is at that time it's a very handy way of seeing things because it makes life more easier and it makes it easier to make decisions. But gradually I started to understand that things were not so black and white, that it was much more an issue of shades of gray, and that not all dissidents were nice people, some of them were actually pretty nasty guys, and that not all KGB officers were bastards, and some just happened to have the job because they, it's a choice in life. It's a direction that sometimes happens almost unnoticeably. So gradually I understood that the whole picture of a society is that you have, say, 95% of the population that lives, that complies, that lives by, that tries to survive, and you have a small group that resists, and you have a small group that collaborates. And among the resistors, the heroes, there are also quite often people that become a hero by sheer coincidence, something that they didn't really choose. So coming from the Netherlands and looking at issues of war and dissidents, one of the big themes, of course, is the Second World War and the Holocaust and what happened with the Dutch population. And so several years ago, I wrote a book comparing the Holocaust in the Netherlands with what happened here in Lithuania. And the interesting thing is that the Netherlands has been able to create this image of a country that very strongly resisted the German occupation, that helped the Jews, and, you know, really brave nation. And then if you go a little bit deeper, it turns out that things are not as good as they seem. It's a fata morgana that they have been able to construct. And especially when I wrote a book about my uncle and I interviewed people with whom he had been in the resistance and people who had been in the camps, a lot of them told me that, you know, actually the main enemy of the resistance until 1943, 1944 was the Dutch population. Because they would say, well, listen, you know, you guys are bombing police stations, you're blowing up municipal buildings, the Germans react and our lives become more difficult. If you just lie low and be quiet, then nothing will happen and we'll survive the war. And only in 1944, people started joining the resistance because everybody understood that the Germans were going to lose. And then a lot of people joined in March and April 1945 because, you know, the war was almost gone and it would look very good on your CV if you had been a member of the Dutch resistance. The prime example for me is the Dutch railway system, which worked perfectly since until September 1944. Even Eichmann, at a certain moment, said that he was surprised about the punctuality of the Dutch railway system. And this railway system not only sent German troops to northern France in 1940 during the war, they also sent Dutch prisoners of war to Germany. They also sent 400,000 Dutch men as forced laborers to Germany, and they sent 112,000 Jews to the extermination camps in Poland. And so, in a way, the Dutch did not kill the Jews themselves, they just put them on a transport in order to have others kill them. And when this guy was interviewed after the war, the director of the railway system, and they said, well, you know, why did you do this? Why did you let the trains run this smoothly? He said, you know, I don't understand the question, because we really tried to transport the Jews very humanely. And when the Germans forbade us to use passenger trains and we started using cattle carriages, actually, you know, Jews tend to travel with a lot of luggage. So for them, it was much more, you know, handy to have these cattle wagons. And he couldn't understand that morally he had degenerated to this level. Then if you look at Lithuania, Lithuania is known in the world as, you know, the Jew killers. And yes, indeed, things went very ferociously here, and there was an active participation, very sadly also by a lot of the people that were partisans against the Soviet regime. And so you get this strange mixture of victim and perpetrator. But if you look at the actual numbers, it is not so much different. In Lithuania, it just happened very quickly and in a very kind of organized fashion. So the end result was that during the first 6 months of the war, already 65% of the Jews in Lithuania had been killed, while the Jews in Amsterdam were still walking around without the yellow stars. But if you look at the absolute numbers, the percentages of Jews killed in the Netherlands and in Lithuania is not so different. The big difference is that the Lithuanian kills were killed here, and the Dutch nicely put them on the train so they didn't have to do the killing themselves. So the big question is, you know, who are these people that participate in these mass murders, in genocide? And of course there is there are all kinds of mechanisms. There has been a lot of studies trying to explain how it is possible that normal people like you and me become mass killers. And the shocking thing is that it is normal people that become mass killers. And there are various mechanisms. One is, you know, you separate the groups. It's them that you're going to kill. It's not part of your own group. So then it becomes easier to kill them. You denigrate them morally, you put them outside your social group by, for instance, forbidding them to walk on the sidewalk, or for forbidding them to go to the cinema or to the park or anything else. You have this kind of language stuff, like the Germans used to talk about people killed in the mobile gas chambers, not like people, but they would say, today we managed 200 logs, meaning that they killed 200 people in one of the trucks. And then there is this very strange thing of blaming the victim. Like, why didn't you resist? Why did you keep on standing there? Why didn't you run away? Why didn't you fight? If you would have run, then I wouldn't have had the chance to kill you. So, you know, I'm not to blame. You as a victim, you yourself are to blame. And then there is this kind of idea that, well, they must be crazy. You know, they're psychopaths. And actually they're not. This is the scary thing, that psychopaths are not mass murderers, because psychopaths cannot follow orders. They, you know, they go beyond. So a murderous machine needs actually normal people like you and me, who follow orders and do what they're being told. And then if you look at the leaders even, like the leaders of the Einsatzkommandos here in Eastern Europe, most of them had a university degree. Some of the leaders had a PhD. And funny enough, quite a few of them were lawyers. I don't know what that says. And then if you look at the 22 Nazi leaders that were on trial in Nuremberg, they were all psychiatrically examined. And it turned out that they were all mentally normal. They were not mentally ill. Even the strange Rudolf Hess turned out to be normal, right? And they were very intelligent. The lowest IQ was 122 of Alois Kaltenbrunner. There were two geniuses who had 146 and 148. So intelligence means nothing. It doesn't say anything about your ability to kill or not. So when things like this happen, like in Rwanda, like here in the East, like in many other places in the world, how do you recover from this? How do you go on? And I think recent history has shown very nice examples of how a country is dealing with this. One of the finest, I think, is in South Africa, this Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which really helped the country to cover this barrier, this enormous hurdle, and to bring the country back into a situation where you can actually deal with a painful past. And also for perpetrators, it's very important to deal with what they did. There is a very recent example, this bookkeeper from Auschwitz, who is a guy who is in his early 90s, who couldn't stand the idea that he would die without having gone to court. He wanted to be tried because that is the only way in which he could die peacefully. My own digestion came about 7, 8 years ago when I was writing a book about the issue of political abuse of psychiatry, and one of the main characters in my book turned out to be an East German professor of psychiatry. We met once in 1988, and just for a few seconds, and later he told me that, you know, Robert, you were mortally dangerous. If there would be one photo of me with you, I would have been finished. Because he was a Stasi agent. And what I found out was that he was a very honest, ethical Stasi agent. He's probably one of the most ethical people I met in my life. He was defending his country, he refused to spy on people, but he believed in the system that he was defending. And the result is that he lost his job, he lost his family, and for 8 years he lived in Saudi Arabia, and the only thing he was writing about in his diary was suicide. So if I go back to Ukraine, there is now this whole process of lustration, trying to put people on trial who have been part of the old regime. The whole question is whether it makes any sense in Ukraine, because anybody who was anything in Ukraine over the past 25 years was involved in corruption. There is no way that you could have done business in Ukraine in the 90s or the first 12, 13 years of this century without being corrupt, because without corruption nothing functioned. Everybody was part of one and the same system. And so the big question is, who has the moral right to judge others and to say that you are wrong? And the big problem, what appears now, is that lustration becomes a tool for personal vengeance. You want to deal with that and that person, on anybody there is a case. So people are just put on trial because they are not very much needed by the current leadership, which doesn't automatically mean that they were the most corrupt. If I look again at Ukraine, and I remember what is going to happen tonight, in less than 2 hours from now, I think what is very important for Ukraine is to think about reconciliation. There are two parts of Ukraine, the LNR, DNR, which everybody knows will become part of Ukraine again, sooner or later. There has been murder, there has been rape, there has been enormous hatred. So how are you going to bring these people back into the country? And then, how do you move out from the from the past with all the corruption and the stealing and the thievery. And I think the main way to do this is to invest in the young generation. I mean, for me, this is the reason why I teach here in Lithuania, where I teach in Georgia, why I teach in Ukraine. I think investing in the young generation is the most important thing to do, because it's they who started Maidan, it's they who have to finish Maidan. And so, this is the poster of the action which is now taking place in Kiev tonight. And it says, "For whom the bell tolls." And it's highly symbolic, because those who will hear the bells, they will know whether the bell is tolling for them or not. And again, it's the young people who remind the people in power that, listen, Maidan started, but Maidan hasn't finished yet. Maidan is still continuing. Thank you.